fire. Right, let's just make sure all this works. Okay, we go. Right. Good. Okay, well, we've got 45,000 years of history to get through, so we better get on, I think. But, I mean, look, we've heard a lot of great lectures today, and it's all about the megalithic culture and their achievements over the last 5,500 years. But in all honesty, that's not when it begins. It begins much, much earlier than that. In fact, I can show you that it almost certainly begins in the Paleolithic age. And the evidence is mounting for this, not just with Göbekli Tepe, but other places and other sites and other discoveries, which I'm going to show you today. But the other big question is, what is civilization? Where does civilization come from? And what about cosmology? All these different ideas that we find in connection with stone circles and other types of megalithic sites, where do they come from originally? Who contrived, who brought together these ideas for the first time? And I think I have an answer. But to do this, we're going to have to start by going to Egypt. And look at some of the most iconic monuments of the world. And of course, we're talking about the three main pyramids of Giza. Now, who built them, why, and when are questions that we need to answer before we can go any further. Now, call me old-fashioned, if you like, but I think that they were actually constructed by the pharaohs, Khufu, Khafre and Menkaure, and that almost certainly, sorry to flick that too quickly, they were constructed in what's known as the Old Kingdom period of ancient Egyptian history, in the so-called 4th dynasty, approximately around 2550 to 2500 BC. But what were they? Now, I mean, obviously there are all sorts of theories on what the pyramids represent, but I, again, a bit of a traditionalist here, consider that they are tombs of pharaohs. However, the term tomb, I think, is absolutely inadequate, because when we think of tombs, we think of something in a churchyard. It would be more accurate to refer to these structures as ascension machines, basically, because the whole idea was to project the soul or spirit of the pharaoh to the stars itself. And that's what all of the internal architecture, all of the cosmology, all the different ideas about them were focused on this one idea. So I think this is actually a good term. Now, what about the cosmology? Well, obviously there are different theories and ideas, many of which you already know. But let's go back to the basics here, because the 4th dynasty pyramids, like those at Giza, do not have any inscriptions inside them. So simply from going inside and looking around, you cannot get an absolute accurate idea of what the death journey was of the ancient Egyptians. Plus also, it may well be that there was a different death journey for the pharaoh than what there was for the common people. But shortly after the pyramids were constructed, the so-called pyramid text started to appear inside later pyramids. And these start from around 2350 BC. And there are various pyramids, particularly at Saqqara and Abu Sir, which are part of the Memphis necropolis, of which Giza is a part, that tell us what the pharaoh had to say and the magic spells that he had to do in order to reach the afterlife. That's what they were basically about. And the pyramid texts make it clear that the soul or spirit of the pharaoh on death becomes the god Osiris. Okay, now Osiris was the god of death, but he wasn't just, looking out over the dead. He was the dead god. He was the god that is dead, because of the fact that his evil brother Set tricked him into a box and threw it into the Nile, and he died. And so he represents death in many ways. But basically, in addition to this identification, the Pharaoh had to go through a specific cosmic geography to reach the afterlife. And this begins with him or her going to the horizon, the western horizon, and then going underneath the earth in something that was known as the Duat. And what they would then do is go through various trials and tribulations, which is why they would need all these magic spells and sayings to deal with all of the monsters and demons and creatures that they would encounter. And he would then appear at just before dawn on the eastern horizon and would then rise up into the sky to be greeted by a god named Sa, and also Sa's sister, Sopdet. Now, these are stars, and almost certainly they are represented in the sky by Orion and by Sirius. Now, these are constellations of the southern sky, essentially, eastern stroke southern sky. And there doesn't seem to be any doubt about this. Archaeo astronomers are quite happy to accept this. However, and this is the big however, the journey does not end there. Because what is quite clear from the pyramid texts is that they're directional. They start with the sarcophagus on the western end of the chambers, of which is where they're found in various of the pyramids, or in fact nearly all of them. And they're then directional because they tell the journey, they tell the journey to the pharaoh as he's travelling from west towards east, which obviously represents his movement through the Duat. But then, at the end, instead of it ending in the east, they then change and go towards the north. And the final sayings within the pyramid texts relate to, that the pharaoh being pushed into the northern part of the sky. And here, so I'll come back to that in a second, but here is the afterlife to be found. But people will say, well, hold on, this is obviously relating to later pyramids. What about the Great Pyramid and its neighbours? Well, the layout of the Great Pyramid and its neighbours is essentially the same as those from the later period, the 5th and 6th dynasties. The sarcophagus is north-south orientated, it's in the western side, and the directionality is exactly the same. You go to the east, and then you turn to the north and go towards the place of the afterlife. And this is something which is quite obviously seen by the fact that the entrances to all of the main pyramids in the Memphis necropolis are towards the north. Here's the ones, for instance, behind me at Giza, and they all have their entrances facing towards the north. And these entrances are connected with these long passages, which, although we call them descending passages, because obviously we're going into them and descending down, are like gun barrels pointing the soul or spirit of the pharaoh towards the north. So where do they go in the north? Well, the last two main translators of the pyramid texts, who is R.O. Faulkner and James P. Allen, both make it clear in their commentaries that the pharaoh is going towards what are known as the indestructible or the imperishable stars. In other words, the stars that revolve around the centre of the sky in the north, and possibly even some of the stars that set just a little bit and then rise again, the so-called grazing stars. So this is the destination of the soul of the pharaoh, not Orion, okay? Orion is a stepping stone towards the final place of the afterlife, the final land of the dead in ancient Egyptian tradition. So there are other things that are stated about what happens, not just after the mummy is interred within the sarcophagus, but where it goes after that. Because the sarcophagus, the coffin, even the sarcophagus chamber itself, all represent the womb of a goddess. And her name is Nut, just N-U-T. Now, she is the sky goddess, and we're going to be encountering her shortly. But basically, it is suggested that the sarcophagus And as I say, the coffin and the chamber itself are like a representation, like a material form of the cosmic womb of the goddess Nuit, okay? And so, basically, where in the sky is Nuit, if she's, supposedly amongst the northern stars? Well, an American astronomer by the name of Ronald Wells looked into this and has written various academic papers, and he is pretty certain that it was in the vicinity of the constellation of Cygnus. Cygnus means swan in Latin. It's a constellation of the swan or the celestial bird. It's seen as a different type of bird in many different countries around the world. And he noticed the fact that Nuit, in her role as the arched sky goddess, naked right over the sky itself, bore a great similarity to the Milky Way as it appears in the northern hemisphere. And he and various other Egyptologists have all concluded, therefore, that Nuit wasn't simply a personification of the sky in general, but she was a personification of the Milky Way, and that the Milky Way represented the road or river along which that the spirit of the pharaoh reached the afterlife. In other words, there was a cosmic journey involved with Nuit herself, but that final rebirth would take place in the vicinity of the Cygnus constellation, which is located where this particular star group, where the Milky Way splits into two to create what's known as the dark rift, and you can see that here. And there's Cygnus there, and it goes all the way down to the area of the constellations of Sagittarius and Scorpius. And yeah, that's essentially that. But I mean, the idea of seeing the Milky Way as a goddess might seem a little strange at first, but most of us have probably never seen the Milky Way stretching from horizon to horizon, because you cannot see it in this country. I mean, I've only ever seen it once in my life, and it was in a desert in Texas where there was no light pollution, and it's extraordinary. And when I looked at that, I thought, yeah, I now understand why the ancient Egyptians may have seen the Milky Way as this goddess arched over the earth. It makes absolute sense. And in later times, beyond the pyramid texts into the Middle Kingdom, it would seem that Nuit herself actually became a personification of the Cygnus constellation, because Cygnus, being connected with the swan, which is very much to do with birth and cosmic origins in many countries around the world, was very often seen as female and a goddess. For instance, in Siberia, it's associated with the goddess Umaya, who's one of the key goddesses of cosmic birth. In India, the goddess is Sarasvati. Her vehicle is also the swan. She also relates to cosmic birth, etc., etc. It's found all the way around the world. It's part of the same universal tradition. So, if that's the case, is there some kind of geography on the ground that relates to this interest in this particular constellation? Well, for that, we just have to go back to Giza and look at a few very basic things to do with landscape geometry. Now, if you have three things, it doesn't matter where they are placed, they will create an arc of a circle. And indeed, that's the case with the three main pyramids of Giza, which you can see here. They form an arc. Well, if you try and trace the centre of that arc, it comes to a spot just over 2 kilometres to the southeast of the pyramid field. And if you continue that line to just under 3 kilometres, in fact, it's about 2,900 kilometres along the exact line, something incredible can be seen. And that's the fact that the three so-called wing stars of Cygnus can be seen to set down into the three pyramids and extinguish into each of the three peaks, the three pyramidions as they would have been originally, even though they're not there today. And this was work done by my colleague Rodney Hale, who's been connected with the Earth Mysteries since the 1970s. I worked very closely with him in a lot of this work. And what you see here is not just some, drawing with a few lines on. This was done with a digital program that he created with all of the geographical coordinates of everything on the plateau, with all of the stars programmed into this and their movements to show how accurate this was. And this is what you would have seen. You'd have seen that the three wing stars, which you can see here, the third pyramid is on the left, and the stars would have set down one after the other into the three pyramids. Now there's a brighter star here it is again, called Deneb, and we'll talk about that in a second. This is the view that you see now from that location towards the pyramid. Myself, Hugh and JJ were there earlier on this year, and we took these photographs from this old factory there, but quite clearly it's a view that is probably going to be blocked sometime soon because of all this urban development that's going up there, which is a shame, obviously. But not only do you have this relationship on the horizontal plane to do with the stars of Cygnus and the three pyramids, but it's also there in the vertical plane. Because if you were to go overhead those three pyramids, each one is in the exact same geographical positions as the three stars as they are above. In other words, this connection with those three Cygnus stars works on two planes, the horizontal and the vertical. And that is very, very special, and I think very unique, because that's the best match of those stars against the three pyramids. But there's even more. I mean, obviously this is the Sphinx, as you can see here, but I'm not focusing on that. I'm focusing on that rocky knoll behind it, which is known as Göbekli. I say, well, how we pronounce it. Obviously, it's probably not pronounced like that locally. And it's also known as Tepe, which means the beginning, the place of the beginning, the place where it starts, basically. And that's very interesting because I am certain that this was the original survey point for the plateau. In other words, at the beginning of the Pyramid Age, a surveyor went up there and measured from that point outwards and created some kind of grand design, which ended up with the positioning of the three pyramids. But also, it's very interesting because from this exact point, you can see the other star in Cygnus, the big bright one, Deneb, set perfectly down into the peak of the second pyramid. So again, this just seems beyond coincidence. And this is the tracking of that star that's digitally done by Rodney Hale to show how accurate it is. And that's for a date of around 2550 to 2500 BC. So where did all these ideas come from? If there is this connection with Cygnus, where did this cosmology come from? Well, I think the answer is a place called Helwan, somewhere that you probably have not come across before. But let me explain to you why it's important. Because going back to the pyramid field, if you extend those lines out a little bit more, up here you've got the second pyramid, Göbekli, the centre of the arc circle, the convergence point, as we call it, which is where you see the three stars of Cygnus set down into position. If you carry along that exact line, which some people might call a ley line, if you continue it on about 20 miles, you come to the centre of what's today a thriving city, but was once a small village called Helwan. This is an incredibly important place for various reasons. I mean, firstly, you have an incredible view from here of all the main pyramid fields, including Giza. This is from Baedeker's Guide to Egypt, dating to 1884, and you can see, the various pyramid fields. So there's a perfect view of the Giza pyramids from this point. But Helwan is important to us because in the late 19th century, it became a spa resort because of the high elevation of the land there. It was the beginning also of the Arabian desert. And a lot of Europeans went over there and they obviously started walking around. And what they noticed was that around the springs, there were three different types of springs there. they were finding hundreds and thousands of stone tools. Now, some of them looked like this, and some of them were so beautiful, with such perfection, that the Egyptologists of the period refused to accept that they were old and said, oh, these must be medieval, or at best to do with the ancient Egyptians. I mean, people like August Maria Karl Lepsius, really famous Egyptologists at the time, refused to accept anything was going on at Helwan. And this is one of the reasons why we're only rediscovering all of this today. Because some of these tools, we now know, date to about 18 to 19,000 BC, and continue on towards the end of the Paleolithic Age and pick up again around 8,000 BC, and then carry on through the end of what's known as the pre-pottery Neolithic, about 6,000 BC. And after that, further settlements in the area continued the tradition right the way down to the time of the pharaohs and the time of the Pyramid Age. But what's also interesting is that there seems to be accounts, so-called building texts or creation accounts, that make reference to what is Helwan. At Edfu in southern Egypt, there is an incredible temple complex which was constructed quite late but replaced an Old Kingdom structure. And on its walls are what's known as the building texts. Now, these talk about the creation of the world from the primeval waters, the first island, which is known as the island of the egg, and about these primeval beings that existed there that end up creating the first structure, the first enclosure. Then it talks about a cataclysm that destroyed everything and made these primeval beings into ghosts. Quite clearly, they were now dead, but they still were hanging around. And then a new set of beings turn up who are quite clearly associated with the bird. In fact, the first lot were connected with the falcon as well. But the second lot are commanded by a leader called the Falcon, and they're known as the Shebtu. And they continue the tradition after this cataclysm, which I'm pretty certain was this comet impact that we now know took place around 10,800 BC and rocked the world for several hundred years afterwards. And I think that almost certainly that's what it refers to. And my colleague Graham Hancock accepts this as well. And I think that this is something that's now pretty well established, that there was something terrible that took place in the world around this time, and that we are only now not just understanding it, but accepting the fact that it did take place in such recent, history. But these Edfu texts talk very specifically about the area where these begin. And they talk about the construction of the first enclosure where there was this structure that surrounds a spring or well, a primeval spring or well. And a woman by the name of E.A.E. Raymond, who was a Polish-born Egyptologist that wrote the definitive book on the Edfu building text, was pretty certain that this primeval structure, the first enclosure, first temple in Egypt, was located somewhere in the vicinity of Memphis. Now, Memphis is on the same latitude as Helwan, and for various reasons which I outline in the book, I'm certain that this is where she was referring to. And it talks about this falcon actually coming out of what appears to be the north and landing on this perch and establishing like this second phase of activity at this place on the island of the egg, which is also known as the homeland of the primeval ones. And what's interesting is that at Edfu itself, not only are all these texts on the walls, and this is unique because it's the only place that we've got the complete text. I mean, they're mentioned here and there, and quite clearly they go back to the foundations of pharaonic history. But in the Holy of Holies, which is at the northern end, very important here, northern end of the Edfu temple, which is dedicated to Horus, by the way, the falcon, there is this weird structure that looks like a granite sentry box, which actually represents what's known as the Ben stone. Now, this is the stone of first creation, and the cult centre at a place called Heliopolis had a similar idea of this bird coming and perching on this stone known as the Ben stone at the beginning of time, the beginning of creation, and like creating the first day, and from everything else, began from that position outwards, the first island, the first land, etc., etc. And the Heliopolitan, let me just show that boat. Now that boat is a stone boat at Edfu, and it represents the boat down which this falcon descended from heaven. And look, it's facing towards the south. It came out of the north. And I think that this is a memory of this same tradition that the ancient Egyptians had, that the cosmic origins related to the north, the same place where the soul goes at death. So that's really, really interesting. Now, the bird of creation in Heliopolis, which is a cult centre just to the northeast of modern-day Cairo, was this bird here. You can see it's known as the Bennu bird. It's probably some kind of heron, but it's exactly the same story as what you find in connection with the Edfu building texts. And you can see it perched on the Ben stone there. But what's so interesting is that Helwan was known in the past as Bennu. In other words, the place of the Bennu bird. And I argue that, and other people have suggested, Egyptologists, that Heliopolis itself was originally at Helwan, and that the current cult centre of Heliopolis, which was the centre of the god Ra or Re, which was very much associated with the cosmology of the pyramid fields at Giza, was essentially, they stole their creation myths and their traditions from Helwan and just basically wiped it clean and just forgot about it, basically. Other names of Helwan is An or Anu, which basically means sky or heaven, and also Ain or Ayan, which basically is the Hebrew word for spring, which again refers to the fact that its first settlements were formed around springs. And this was the original place of first creation, in my opinion. And it refers to activity that was going on there, not just before the Younger Dryas comet impact event, which is what they call it, the one that happened around 10,800 BC, but also activity that continued there afterwards, from about 8,000 BC onwards. My friend, the artist Russell Hussein, created this image of what we think the original temple looked like at Helwan, based on everything that's given in the Edfu text, and also what we know of the most earliest cult structures in that region from this period, which you can see here. So it's quite a striking image, and that's in the Cygnus Key book. But this is where it starts getting interesting, because it was Professor Klaus Schmidt, a man who we know in connection with Göbekli Tepe. He was the rediscoverer of Göbekli Tepe in 1994 that first realised the significance of Helwan. And not only did he review the earliest tools that were discovered there during the 19th century, of which there are thousands and thousands. I mean, big things were going on there, no question. But he focused in on a particular type of projectile point, which is known as the Helwan point, clearly because it was first discovered at Helwan. And it was realised a long time ago that this point also was found at various sites in the Levant, including Jericho, for instance. And it was suggested that its origin may have been somewhere on the middle Euphrates or whatever. But what Professor Klaus Schmidt realised was that examples of these were being found at Göbekli Tepe in southeast Turkey, dating at least 11,000 years old. And that they were being found at other sites in the region, like Navali Chori and another pre-Piratori Neolithic site, actually in Şanlıurfa, which is a city very close to Göbekli Tepe, and that there was clearly some relationship. Now, he doesn't push the subject, but others have come since that, having read the paper that Schmidt did on this subject in 1996, which I quote in detail, because I think this is an incredibly important paper, because what it shows is there was a relationship between everything that was going on at Helwan and what was happening at Göbekli Tepe. And almost certainly what this means is that there may well have been a settlement with either direct or indirect links with Göbekli Tepe in Egypt on the edge of the Nile Valley as early as 8000 BC. And I mean arguably earlier, but we'll call it that because that's what the evidence shows us at this time. So that, of course, brings us into Göbekli itself. Now, many of you, will obviously have seen many images of it and know quite a bit about it, but it was constructed initially around 9600 BC at the very end of the so-called Younger Dryas event, which was this cold spell or mini ice age that lasted for 1200 years after the impact event. And it consists of a series of stone enclosures with T-shaped pillars, many of them carved. They're like spokes of a wheel. There's a few images here. And building went on between about 9600 BC to about 8000 BC when the site was abandoned finally. By the way, it was not all abandoned at the same time. I mean, they were gradually covering up enclosures and then building another one on top or building another one to the side or whatever. I mean, you'll read in some books that they just, upped and left all in one go. That's not what happened. They closed shop around 8000 BC, but it wasn't necessarily because of anything dramatic, just that things were now changing, and and the Neolithic revolution had started, by the way, as well. This is roughly what these enclosures would have looked like in the past, and this is the centre of enclosure D, the oldest and most accomplished and most sophisticated of all of the enclosures, because that's very interesting. The best and the most sophisticated enclosures are the oldest ones, and they date to about 9600 BC, like this one. But what I discovered working with my colleague Rodney Hale, the engineer, is that the mean azimuth of the central pillars, these two huge great pillars that you see here, not only in enclosure D, but enclosure C, enclosure B, and enclosure H, all point towards the setting of the bright star Deneb in the constellation of Cygnus for the exact time frame that they would have been constructed based on carbon-14 dating and other stratigraphy and evidence that's come out to do with points and stuff like this. And now this I put as early as 2006 in a previous book I did called The Cygnus Mystery, right, which has nothing to do with this current book, by the way. And so these people would seem to have had an interest in Cygnus exactly the same as the people at Giza. And enhancing this even further is the fact that at the back of three of the enclosures, oh, hold on, it's pressing the wrong buttons, are these Holt stones, these strange porthole stones is the correct term that you'd use for them. There you go, there. That one's there, right behind it. Now, it's absolutely precisely behind it, and it's the only stone that is actually side on to the centre of the enclosure. All the rest of them are like spokes of a wheel. So it obviously had a significance, and I believe it was almost like an original altar. And these holes are like exits from this world and entries into otherworldly environments for shamans doing their ceremonies and rituals inside these structures. And obviously the idea of holes being the points of connection with the other world is something that's very strong and known in many shamanic traditions around the world. So, this, and so in other words, these porthole stones further enhance this connection with the setting of Deneb in Cygnus, because in theory, you'd have been able to stand in the centre of these enclosures and actually look through these porthole stones at the star setting during the epoch of construction. Now, whether this was actual or symbolic or whatever, we don't know. But, it's there, and I think that's important. So that's that. Oops, sorry, I'm going backwards. Sorry, pressing the wrong buttons. But probably the most important and most famous of all the stones at Göbekli Tepe is Pillar 43. Now, that's in enclosure D. It's right next to the porthole stone. There's the porthole stone there. Right next to it is the vulture stone in the north-northwest. And this is something I've looked at a lot, and I would not be the first person that said that I'm pretty certain that it actually, that there's a vulture on there, a big weird-looking flappy-winged vulture there, and that this represents the constellation of Cygnus. The vulture was one of the symbols of Cygnus on the Euphrates and in Greek tradition, but also in Armenia, which is the neighbouring country to what is today Turkey. There was a constellation of the vulture known as Angelk, which, was important, also means angel, interesting enough. And in the knowledge that Armenia originally included the area of Göbekli Tepe, I think that this is something that's important and can't be ignored. And now some of my colleagues think that the vulture represents Sagittarius. I don't accept that at all, and that the strange bull on the shoulder of the thing, I'll show it to you in the next picture, represents the sun going through Sagittarius. I don't think it's that at all. The bull represents two things. Firstly, it's the soul of either the deceased or the shaman in the otherworldly environment going into the afterlife, because the soul was seen to inhabit the skull, the head, basically. And that became a symbol of the soul, not just in Near Eastern tradition, where they would actually remove the skulls and decorate them and communicate with the ancestors through them. But it's a universal thing. I mean, you find it in Native American tradition as well, where the actual symbol of the soul or spirit is actually a little skull. Well, at Göbekli Tepe and in southeast Turkey, this circle becomes a representative of that soul. And I've got academic references for this, so that's pretty well established. But it also, I think, represents this hole between this world and the other world. Because my colleague Rodney Hale looked at the imagery of the vulture stone and was able to accurately align it so that if the bull is superimposed with the northern celestial pole, the centre of the sky, which you can see here, right, that Cygnus is in its perfect place. This is the horizon, the local horizon, and beneath it is Scorpius, exactly where the scorpion is on the vulture stone itself. And it was Juan Belmonte, an archaeoastronomer, who first identified that scorpion on Pillar 43 as a representation of the constellation of Scorpius. So almost certainly all that you see on Pillar 43 is astronomical in nature. I mean, we could have a whole debate on what all of the other, different animals and birds represent. But in my opinion, the main vulture represents Cygnus, the scorpion represents Scorpius. The line dividing the two sides, the two parts of the stone represents the local horizon, and the bull or soul is at the exact point of the northern celestial pole, quite clearly showing that that's its destination. The vulture of Cygnus is guarding that entrance. And as to why those two should be together, it's all to do with the Milky Way, because universally, the Milky Way is a road or river to the stars. It's there, for instance, amongst 30 to 40 different Native American tribes, where there is a cosmic death journey that's repeated again and again and again. You start from the physical world, you make a leap of faith onto the Milky Way in the area of Orion, which is obviously the same thing as we get in Egypt, and from there you go round the Milky Way to where the Milky Way splits in two. And here you meet this bird-headed creature, this is a Native American tradition, known as brain smasher. I know it's a crude term, but it actually all relates to the release of the soul from the skull. And from this point onwards, you would enter the afterlife. And as I show in my books, including the new one, this is a universal concept. The idea of using the Milky Way to reach the afterlife. The point of entrance into it is somewhere in the vicinity of either Cygnus and or the northern celestial pole, and the points of access onto the Milky Way are at two sides of the sky. On one side It's where the sun crosses in the vicinity of Sagittarius and Scorpius. On the other side of the sky, it's where the sun crosses the Milky Way in the vicinity of Taurus, Gemini, Orion, and the Pleiades. Those are the points of entry onto it. It was necessary to make that journey to reach your destination. My colleague Greg Little has been looking at a large number of mound complexes in North America and has found that they are repeatedly, again and again, aligned to Orion, Cygnus, and particularly at the time of the midwinter solstice. And of course, it's there in this country. I mean, it's there at Avebury, it's there at Wayland Smithy, it's there at many other stone circles around the country. You have this same connection, certainly with Cygnus there. This was something that John North, who came up with the first stuff. But these ideas, anyway, are not new. They can be found, for instance, at the Lascaux Cave in southern France, in the Dordogne region, where you have this very strange image of a bison, this birds again, and this bird on a pole. And a German archaeoastronomer by the name of Michael Rappengluck of Munich University realized that this was actually showing the area of the sky in the very north, because around 15 to 16,000 BC, because the northern celestial pole at that time corresponded to the Cygnus constellation. The two were together for about 3,000 to 4,000 years. And a lot of the ideas that connect Cygnus as the place of the entry into the afterlife are leftovers that continued to remain amongst the human populations through to the time of Göbekli Tepe. I mean, for instance, this image here, done by my good friend Nick Burton, shows the interior of this so-called well shaft at Lascaux. And those images of the bison, the birdman, and the bird on the pole, which, by the way, the bird on the pole is the cosmic axis, with the bird on top is Cygnus itself. And it's in the north, exactly where it should be placed. It's almost like this is like some kind of, Ice Age observatory, symbolically, of course, looking as if you could see through the walls of the well shaft towards those exact stars where they would be in the sky. And I believe that even these ideas weren't even new at this time, that they go back at much earlier age. Now, the Edfu building texts tell us a lot more about the first enclosure. Not only do they say that it had to be in the north, because obviously of the connections with the northern stars, but it also tells us that specific geometry was involved. I mean, Robin Heath was talking about the use of 3-2 and 4-3 triangles. Well, that's exactly what the Edfu building texts talk about, particularly the 3-2. And we find this in the grand design at Giza, that the 3-2 and the 4-3 triangles, which is something that is here, but unfortunately we haven't got time to go into today. But more importantly, and I think this is going to interest you far, far more, is that it's also at Göbekli Tepe. That is a perfect 4-3 ellipse, and that matches exactly the inner shape of enclosure D at Göbekli Tepe. And not only that, but the centre line of it goes precisely through the porthole stone. It's perfectly aligned. Plus, the two central pillars are also 1/3 distance using that same 4-3 ellipse. But it's not just on enclosure D. It's their enclosure C as well, which has two areas. They put a smaller stone circle inside the bigger one at a later date. That also goes straight through the porthole stone. There's a porthole stone there as well. That one's broken and on its side. And this is enclosure H, which is still under excavation at the moment. And tentatively, that also has the same 4-3 ellipse shape. Now, why the archaeologists haven't sussed this, I just don't know. I mean, I'm telling you, this is the first time, essentially, I've mentioned this in public, but it's quite extraordinary. And it's not just at Göbekli Tepe. This is Djerf El Amar, which is a pre-pottery Neolithic site, goes back to at least 9,000 BC in northern Syria, and you have exactly the same 4-3 ellipse shape there, okay?
I just want to get this a little bit further away from your mouth as
Okay, it's because I'm beginning to shout. Yeah, so I'm getting excited, obviously. Right, okay, so why incorporate 4-3 and 3-2 into structures like this? Well, I think the answer, in my opinion, is quite plain: sound acoustics. Because 4-3 and 3-2 ratios in architecture relate to sound acoustics. Because whether this is symbolic or practical, it enhances the acoustics of a place, not just simply because of the shape, but because the 4-3 and the 3-2 relate to what's known as musical intervals. And these are the combinations of two notes to create these perfect sounds. So the 4-3 relates to the perfect fourth, and the 3-2 ratio, which is simply the inverse form. They're both exactly the same, but one's an inverse form of the other, relates to what's known as the perfect fifth. Now, I'm assuming that at some point Steve Marshall has presented his work on the Long Barrows, which one is it? West Kennet Long Barrow, and all the work that he's done to do with sound acoustics there. He also found that it related to the 4-3 ratio, and that this was incredibly important to the sound acoustics of West Kennet Long Barrow. And what's interesting is that in architectural design, even to this day, 4-3 ratios are used to enhance sound acoustics. Did you know that? No, it's a fact. I've quoted the references in my book. I couldn't believe it when I saw it. So in other words, what they're saying in connection with architecture today might as well have been written for Göbekli Tepe. Now, people have suggested in the past that Göbekli Tepe may have been used for sound acoustic reasons, but they have not come up with any kind of specifics to do with geometry or the design of the place. So, where did this cosmology come from? And this is where we start to move away both from Turkey and from Egypt. Where did these ideas come from? Okay, well, in my books, again, within the latest one, I suggest there are certain cultures that introduced these ideas to Göbekli Tepe, and from Göbekli Tepe, they were introduced through the Levant into the Nile Valley. One of which is the Swiderian culture. The Swiderian culture, an incredibly advanced culture that existed in what is today Russia and Ukraine, stretching from the Ural Mountains in the east right the way across to the Carpathians and Poland in the east. And there are similarities in the toolkit found at Göbekli Tepe, which even Klaus Schmidt pointed out at one point. And he even earmarked the Swiderian people as having exactly the same hunting techniques as those of the pre-pottery Neolithic people that created places like Göbekli Tepe and Novali Chori, which is on to the north of there. Doesn't exist today. But so, I think these were very, very important. You can read about them in my book, Göbekli Tepe, Genesis of the Gods. But what I also point out is that I'm pretty certain that a lot of the ideas that came into Göbekli Tepe were originally in the area of the Ural Mountains. And I point out something called the Shingar idol, which dates to about 11,500 years, and is incredibly sophisticated. It's 20 feet long, incredibly sophisticated carvings. And I suggest that there may well be links between the culture that created this and the peoples at Göbekli Tepe, and that very likely that there was communication between the two. And this was very fortuitous. This is in the Cygnus key, because just in the past 2 weeks, archaeologists have come out and said exactly the same thing. These words there, what is this? I can't remember, I haven't got my glasses on. Oh, the art that comes closest to the Shingar idol in terms of location, style and age are the anthropomorphic, 20-foot tall stone structures in Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. Very fortuitous, for what I've written, basically. And I do genuinely believe that the main influences for Göbekli Tepe were coming in from the north, from Russia and from Ukraine. Some of my colleagues would argue they come from Atlantis or the Space Brothers or something, but in my opinion, this makes sense. But is that where they began, the Urals? sometime just before the time of Göbekli Tepe? Well, the answer is no, because I think that they began even further east in the area of the Altai mountains of southern Siberia. And I'm going to talk to you about some discoveries now that at first you'll think, well, hold on, isn't this a big leap? You'll see where I'm going. Because in the 2000s, a few pieces of fossil remains were discovered that were considered to be human. They're at a place called the Denisovan cave, which is it's actually in Russia, but it's on the border between Kazakhstan, China, and Mongolia. You can see here where it is on the map. And this is the Denisovan cave. And the human occupation there goes back at least 280,000 years. And it's layer 11 that takes our interest, because it was in here that they found these human remains, which at first, they thought could be human, might be Neanderthal. But when the genome was done on one of these bones, a small little pinky bone, a finger bone, in 2012, it was realised that this particular human population was not Neanderthal and was not modern human. It came from something else that they'd never seen before. And these people started to be referred to as what I call the Denisovans. Some people might say Denisovans, but it's just easier to say Denisovans, basically. It's like Glastonbury and Glastonbury, isn't it, really? So, who are the Denisovans and why are they relevant to anything that you're talking about today? Well, firstly, we know that the Denisovans mated with modern humans. Probably between about 55 and 45,000 years ago, the Denisovans disappear. Probably around 40,000 years ago. There's no evidence or trace of them after that time. But their legacy was continued on by their hybrid descendants who swept eastwards from what I call the Denisovan line, which stretches from the Sayan Mountains in the north, obviously beyond it would have been the Arctic north, down through the Altai, down through central Asia, down eventually either into the area of what is the Indus Valley in what's today Pakistan, or perhaps a little bit to the east to the area of the Bay of Bengal. But this is where our ancestors first encountered the Denisovans. But as we swept ever eastwards, we carried their DNA, their genes, eastwards into everywhere, from the Russian Far East to China, to Southeast Asia, into India, into Australia, into Melanesia, and into North America and South America. There is no known Denisovan DNA west of the area of the Altai Mountains. Not yet, not been found, certainly in modern populations. The only one possible candidate is Finnish. They seem to have a very small amount of Denisovan DNA and ancestry in them. But what happened when we first met these people for the first time? Well, we'll answer that question in a second, but I want to show you this. This is so important. So important that my colleague Graham Hancock shot out to Denisovan Cave last October. And I must point out at this time that we've been working on the Denisovans and their importance since at least 2013. And I must thank my colleague and friend Debbie Cartwright for insisting that I look into the Denisovans, because they were so important to everything. So cheers, Debbie, thank you for that. Because this changes everything. What you see in front of you is a stone bracelet, as they call it. It's more like a bangle, which is made of a beautiful green stone called chlorite, and it was part of a larger item of jewellery, which you can see here, which possibly would have had something hanging off of it. But what's so important about this is not only is it incredibly finished, but there is a hole through it with a speed drilling rate that's so fast that it almost compares to a modern drill. But the age of this is 60 to 70,000 years ago, and the archaeologists now accept that this was made by the Denisovans, not by us. It was found in layer 11, the Denisovan layer. And the next time that anything like this occurs in the human record is at a place called Ashikli Hoyak in central Turkey, the same culture as Göbekli Tepe. And you can see this beautiful obsidian bracelet here, beautifully finished, but this is only about 10,000 years old. The Denisovan bracelet is 60 to 70,000 years. That changes everything. But there's so much more about the Denisovans that's now coming out. Firstly, and I'm not even going to go into this because it's just too complicated, but certain types of stone tools and stone projectile points begin in the Denisova cave in layer 11, the Denisova level, including something called pressure flaking, or the pressure technique, and microblade technology. It all starts in the Altai Mountains and specifically in the Denisova cave around 40, 50,000 years ago. The Denisovans also created the first needles, the first bone needles. Two beautiful examples have been found, one of which you can see here. They date to at least 40 to 50,000, arguably more, which means they had tailored clothing. And here's where it starts getting even weirder, because they found animal bones, horse bones, inside the Denisova cave, which have suggested to some that the Denisovans not just domesticated horses, but rode them. And this is incredibly significant, because officially we didn't start riding horses until the early Bronze Age. And what you've got to remember there is, where did these Bronze Age ideas come from? The Altai Mountains, the very same area where the Denisovans certainly had their last stand, and certainly were in that area for at least 100, 150,000 years. We know that from the evidence that goes even deeper that relates to them. On top of that, they created the first musical instruments. Evidence of a bone flute or whistle has been found in layer 11, the Denisovan layer, in the Denisova cave. I mean, it's broken, it may have been a flute, may have been a whistle, they're not sure. I don't know what it's even made of. The source I've got doesn't even say. But the other early bone flutes found in that area, all made of bird bones, in particular those of the swan and the goose. Okay, and that's I don't think just coincidence either. Because what's interesting is that in this very area of the Altai and Mongolia, there's a traditional instrument known as the komis. It's a stringed instrument, and what's important about it is that it doesn't matter what notes you play on it. What's important as far as the tuning is that it's tuned to the two musical intervals, 4/3 and 3/2, which is, of course, the perfect fourth and the perfect fifth. It doesn't matter what notes are played, what octaves, but it has to be attuned to those specific musical instruments. But what's interesting is that some of the komises also have their bodies in the 4/3, as you can see here, exactly the same shape as Enclosure D at Göbekli Tepe. Okay, now, all right, we can't say how old the komis is. It's probably a very ancient musical instrument. But what's interesting is, firstly, is that traditionally its neck and head is shaped into that of a swan. And secondly, is that knowledge of how to create the sounds of the komis was said to have come originally from giants. There's a legend about this. I quote it in the book. This is very, very, very important. We'll come back to why that's so important. In other words, this came not from us, but it was knowledge given to us by these giants. We'll come back to who they are. Now, in the very same area, you have the earliest evidence of animism and bird shamanism. Dates to 24,000 years. It's from a site called Malta, which is not far from Lake Baikal, this huge inland sea in the same area. And it's actually, the site's on the river Angora, or a branch of the river Angara. And you find various of these swan pendants, which actually resemble the shape of the komis. But what's interesting is that the archaeologists that studied these believe that this is the origins of the use of a bird to represent the soul, and that the use of the swan was important because it relates to the migration of the bird north and south to what might be seen as an afterlife where the soul goes in the form of a bird. Not always, obviously, in the form of a swan or goose, but sometimes. Not sometimes, quite a lot of the time, to be honest. So, in other words, we're talking about bird shamanism, bird animism, and the origins of the soul being seen as a bird itself. And that what's important here, of course, is what is the most obvious bird in the sky that represents a swan? Oh, Cygnus. Oh, of course it is. And I think that a lot of these ideas to do with Cygnus go back not just to 16,000 BC, when they're found in the Lascaux cave, where the bird there on the pole represents Cygnus. I believe that they go back probably to the time of the Denisovans, because there are various other legends I'm not even going to go into that connect the giants of this region with swans and geese. But what's so interesting is that all around the world there are traditions about what's known as swan maidens. A swan maiden flies down with her mates, takes her swan shrift off, as they call it, or swan feather coat, goes swimming in a pool or whatever it is, and some guy comes along, usually a local farmer, nicks the feather coat so that one of these swan maidens can't fly off as the others, realise what's going on. They all fly off, leaves one, he marries her, and the child that results from it becomes the beginning of these clans or tribes or whatever. Now, this is universal around the world, but academic papers suggest that the origins of this tradition come from Siberia in the Paleolithic age, and I think this is correct. And I don't think it relates to just some swan maiden coming down from the stars. I reckon it's about the connection with the swan and the stars, and the swan being the symbol of the cosmic origin of life and the place where the soul is seen to return to in death. Okay? And even today, the peoples of the Altai, Mongolia, are really, really strong into this whole idea of swan ancestry. The swan people, they're there today. Look, there's an article all about them. You can read about it online. So, if all of this is somehow linked with the Denisovans, why were they so advanced? How did they create that jewellery? Why did they create bone needles? Why were they creating musical instruments? What was going on? Well, here's the answer, in my opinion, and that's the fact that they have a different mindset to us, or had a different mindset, because when the genome was sequenced of the Siberian Denisovan, it was found that it contains one, possibly more genes that relate to autism. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that they were autistic in the sense that we know today, but what it does suggest is that their genes made them think in a different way. Now, what do we know about the so-called savant mind? You can remember incredible knowledge of mathematics and numbers, and precision becomes important to the point of, OCD, literally. And that this allows you deep insights into areas which you wouldn't normally, perhaps, like ourselves, if we haven't got those type of qualities, don't look into. And you think, if you're dealing with a human population that not only had this type of mindset, but also were using hallucinogens, right? I mean, let's just say, or certainly entering altered states of consciousness, what type of mind would that create? I mean, we might be talking about super minds here. The insights of nature itself, the universe, everything. And some indication of this comes from the fact that at Malta, this site near Lake Bacau, they found something incredible, something which we call the Malta plate. It's made of mammoth bone, and it's on the screen in front of you now. You can see both sides of it. On one side, you have these three serpents, and it's got a hole through it. And on the other side, you've got all of these peck marks. Now, these peck marks were found by a guy called Vitaly Larachev, a Russian archaeologists to be very specific in number. And I'm not going to go into them in any huge detail, but some of his work is sort of on the edge of what I'm showing here. But they all relate to time cycles, in particular to do with eclipses. I mean, for instance, the total amount of peck marks is 486 plus 1, 487 in total. The total number of peck marks in the centre is 243. A number that's also very much connected with cycles of eclipses. And also, a number crops up within it that's very important all the way around the world, and that's 432. 432 is found in connection with cultures from Java to Cambodia to India to Mesopotamia to China to Northern Europe and in Egypt, as I show in the book. And I've worked out that this is all related to the combination, not just of long-term eclipse cycles called the triple Saros, but also its synchronization with what we call today the precessional cycle, where the stars move of 1 degree every 72 years against the background. And that this generates certain key numbers, which begin with 216 and then 432. And all of these numbers, 216, 432, 648, and 864, all appear within Vedic texts as the fractionalization of these long-term cycles that go on for millions of years, if not billions of years, you know, the day of Brahma, the night of Brahma, or whatever. And up to now, we've looked at them and thought, you know, why such long numbers? Well, if you think that a savant mind created them in the first place, we can understand why they exist and why we preserve them in virtually every, continent of the world. But there's more than this, because I think that the savant mindset of the Denisovans created shamanism. And I wouldn't be the first person to suggest that there's a relationship between shamanism and shamanic rituals and savant or autistic mindsets. I mean, you think of what, somebody with autistic abilities does. I mean, what do? They do things repeatedly. They repeat things. They have rituals. And of course, that's exactly what shamans do, exactly what magic spells are all about. We do things certain times to achieve something. Why, if we want to change reality, we don't just think it and it happens. If you want to do a spell, why have we got to light 9 candles or do this or whatever? It's because it's clearly a leftover of shamanic activity that's associated with savant qualities, essentially. And it is my opinion that these Denisovans and the Denisovan hybrids that followed them and continued their legacy for tens of thousands of years, reaching essentially every part of the world, something which I'm writing about in a new book now with my colleague Dr. Greg Little, was that they took certain cosmological ideas, certain ideas in geometry, certain ideas in mathematics, and that the people that followed them, their descendants, they told them, you must remember these. And the people probably didn't even understand. By the time it reaches somewhere like Egypt, they probably don't even understand where these things came from in the first place. But that amongst this was an importance in the centre of the sky, which was both the northern celestial pole and when it crossed the Milky Way in the area of the Cygnus constellation, something it does for about 4,000 years or maybe even longer, each precessional cycle. So in other words, all of these ideas go back at least to the time of the Denisovans 40,000 years ago when they were last around. But more than that, and I just want to throw this in as just as that, we think we found what could be the nerve centre of the Denisovans. It's a place called Göbekli. It's in the western Sayan Mountains, not far from the Denisovan cave. And it's seen to be, locally, not just the centre of the world, but also the place where the giants or the gods came together to do all their stuff, basically. And there are various reasons, Paleolithic finds that have been found in the area that suggest that this was their epicenter. It's this massive, elevated platform on the top of a mountain with these 2 enormous horns facing towards the north, which you can see here, one of which is 250 metres tall, the other one's about 150 metres, and all the indications are that this is not just somewhere that they went to do their rituals and ceremonies, but this was the earliest lunar observatory anywhere in the world that we've uncovered so far. But anyway, now we're nearly at the end, but what we need to just understand for finally is what the Denisovans look like. Well, firstly, every piece of fossil remain found so far in connection with the Denisovans has been of giant size. The teeth, when they were first found, it was seen that they were so large, or particularly one, that it was dismissed at first as that of a cave bear. It was so large. It has the chewing area twice the size of us modern humans. The finger bone was large. All the other bits. And although we haven't got a skull of a Denisovan yet, one candidate exists. I mean, I know Hugh's written about this, and it's the Penghu jawbone that was found off of the coast of Taiwan just a few years ago, and it's now being, proposed that this is Denisovan, and it's massive, it's huge. But what's important about that is that it matches another jawbone that was found actually in Europe in 1907, just outside of Heidelberg, at a place called Mauer. And it belongs to an earlier type of human known as Homo heidelbergensis, who could have been the common ancestor of ourselves, the Neanderthals, and the Denisovans, okay? And the significant thing about this is not only is the Mauer skull massive, huge, right, like the Penghu skull, and obviously like the teeth of the Denisovans, which we know, confirmed, but that in South Africa, when found, Homo heidelbergensis is regularly 7 to 7.5 feet tall. Okay? And this is the work of Professor Lee Berger. Again, I know that Hugh's looked into this as well for his books on giants. And in Spain, at a place called Cima de los Huillos, or please excuse the pronunciation, somebody will correct me later, human remains dating to 430,000 years that were considered to belong to Homo heidelbergensis. When they were examined, the DNA was found to be closer to that of the Denisovans than to the Neanderthals. So there is a very good chance that the Denisovans either are the direct descendants of Homo heidelbergensis, or they are Homo heidelbergensis. We don't know yet because, it's too early to find out. So with all this in mind, what did the Denisovans look like? Well, at the moment, all I can do is show you someone who I think looks like them. And it's this gentleman. This is a gentleman named the Great Kali. And he's an Indian gentleman who is a wrestler. And he's still alive today. And look how he compares to the lady next to him. He's 7 feet tall, built like a brick, whatever. And it seems very much likely that the Denisovans were this size. I'm not saying all of them, but certainly some of them were this size. And that ultimately they are the giants of legend. And I don't mean that fairy tale giants. I mean just people that were bigger and taller than us. And once you start realising that, you can start covering the whole globe and looking for evidence of their presence, particularly in North America, which both myself and I know Graham Hancock is looking at. Obviously, Hugh's been looking into this area as well. But what's more important is that the legends of the giants in the Altai state very clearly that the modern human populations owe their ancestry to these giants, and that there is a tradition about these giants, as I already mentioned, giving us the knowledge of the tones, the music of the Comis, which I think is very important. So we have to ask the question at the end of all of this by saying, was civilization gifted to humanity by the Denisovans? And it is my opinion now, and I'm, absolutely certain of this, that the legacy of the Denisovans became the Göbekli Tepe, the Great Pyramids, and everything that we have been associating with a lost civilization. And in my opinion, they are the lost civilization. Thank you very much.